Good evening. Happy Sabbath. It's wonderful to see all of your smiling faces this evening back here at the Loma University Church, and we have quite an evening planned for you to kick off this camp meeting season. We had a wonderful church service. I hope you were all able to make it out for that. And then this evening, we have a pretty remarkable story that some of you may have read the book, some of you may have just heard about it, but Ralph Watts is here with us this evening. But before I officially introduce him, there are a couple of things that I would like to share with you about this evening. So the first thing is, at the end, we will be taking up an offering, and it is for camp meeting, the offering that we're taking up. And then there will be, hopefully, if there is time, a short window and opportunity for some questions. If you have some questions for Ralph at the end that you have been wanting to ask him, we're hoping that we will have some time for that. But it all depends on how long it goes as far as with him sharing, because he actually has to catch a plane this evening. So that's why I say hopefully we'll have time for that. But it's important that he gets on his plane this evening, so we'll just see how the time goes. And then following this evening, we are going to have a social, a watermelon feed that will take place right out here in the courtyard. So we want you to remember that, and I'll remind you again at the evening, at the close of this evening. So let's have a word of prayer, and then we will get started. Father God, we thank you so much for the Sabbath day and for stories like we are going to hear this evening of how you have intervened and how you have shown your power in mighty ways, miraculous ways. So this evening, we just invite you to be present and for you to touch our hearts and inspire us in ways that we have not known before. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, Ralph Watts, I met here at the church, and I had absolutely no idea what was behind this man in the sense of who he was, because to me, when I met him, he was Ralph Watts, the really nice guy that would always greet me out in the foyer or here in the church and would just ask me questions of how I was doing. How are you doing, Joelle? How's ministry going for you? And I just always thought, this is just one of the nicest guys. And then someone told me, do you know who you're talking to? Yeah, that's Ralph. Do you know who he is? He has been in the administration for the GC and worked in the unions, and he was the president of ADRA, and they started telling me all these things. And I thought, oh my word, that is really incredible. But what I like about it is he's so unassuming. He's so down to earth and so humble that he is just a really great individual. And this evening, he is going to share his story and his testimony of a miraculous thing that happened at the Vietnam War. So Ralph, I would like to invite you up here as we get started, and we just hope that you, each of you, are extremely blessed by what he has to share with us this evening.
was Friday afternoon, about 4:15, when the world's largest aircraft lifted off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base on the outskirts of Saigon, one of the busiest airports in the world at that time, with a number of flights that were coming in and out. This aircraft was part of the initiative by the President of the United States, President Gerald Ford. It was called Baby Lift. Some of you that are older will remember the orphan flights. And those orphan flights started the day before, on Thursday. But Friday afternoon was this big aircraft taking off for the United States with all these orphans. And the plane had just ascended to about 23,000 feet over the Gulf of Tonkin when there was a terrible crash at the rear of the plane. The plane shuddered, and the pilot realized he could not make it across the Gulf, so he turned around, headed back to the airport, hoping he could make a landing. Kept losing altitude and didn't make it. Sadly, the plane, just short of the runway, about a mile, crashed into the paddy fields, skidded along for hundreds of yards, broke into about 3 pieces, and then into flames with all those orphans. Probably 300 plus orphans, along with the sponsors that were going along with them. Immediately, helicopters came to the scene to provide aid. They choppered out as quickly as they could those that were the survivors, kids, adults, crew. And they flew them to the nearest hospital, which was only about 3 miles away from that very scene. All night long, the doctors and nurses and attendants tried to save the lives. Terribly burned cases. Those that were on the lower end of the aircraft, 2-tiered, double-decker aircraft, those that were on the bottom, practically without exception, were killed. About the only survivors were those that were on the upper deck. That was about 100. So nearly 200 killed or maimed, burned. I was in Singapore at that time. I had left Saigon just the day before. In and out of Saigon quite a bit during the month of March and April. Saigon was not my home. My home was in Singapore. That's where the union headquarters were. That's where we were based out of. That's where Pat was and our family, our kids, and others of the missionary group that were involved in this whole episode. I knew I had to get back to Saigon. So Sunday, I boarded a flight, Air Vietnam flight, made my way back into Saigon because I knew that there was a lot that needed to be done. Because you understand that all that survived that crash were airlifted to the closest hospital, which happened to be Saigon Adventist Hospital. So they were all taken to our hospital. And that's one of the reasons I felt I need to be back on Sunday, to work with the staff and others to see what more could be done. So as the plane made its final turn into Saigon, I knew which way I knew I had to sit on the right side, window seat, to see the debris. And as I passed over what was the C-5A, the largest airplane at that point in time in existence, I could not believe that anyone could have survived that scene. It was unbelievable. Went to the hospital, met with Harvey Rudisale, who was the administrator, met with some of the doctors, talked about what was needed, and then spent some time that afternoon meeting with the deputy ambassador, which we had set up an appointment for, and the medical director of the embassy, a man by the name of Dustin, Dr. Dustin. And the deputy ambassador's name was Loma. So we had a meeting. And I asked the ambassador, once again, I said, things are getting pretty frightening around here. The South is collapsing. We know it can't stand much longer. I need to know what plans you have in mind to help get our staff out of here. The government has an obligation to the employees of this hospital. This commitment was made 3 years ago when the Peace Accord was assigned. And the United States government was looking for an organization that would provide health care for the Americans that were residing in Vietnam, in Saigon, and for the embassy and USAID personnel. I said, so a commitment has been made to us. A promise has been made to us. And I said, I want to know, what are the plans? I said, we have a place for helicopters to come in. See, the background to the story is that when that peace accord was signed 3 years before, the U.S. government says, we've got to have health care for the Americans. Who do we turn to? They set up a commission, and they explored all kinds of options. Catholics, Baptists, others, all wanted to be a part of this, wanted to have a responsibility in providing the health care. But no, the decision was made, we want the Seventh-day Adventists to provide the health care in Saigon for our people. What a testimony. And one of the reasons for that is this medical center right here. They all were acquainted with Loma Linda. Some of those that were on the commission have been to Loma Linda, had visited Loma Linda, and so the agreement was made. We want the Adventists to come. So when the time came to negotiate the contract and the agreement, as chairman of the board, it was my responsibility to spend considerable time with the contracting officer. But we had representation from the General Conference with us, and we had Roger Hadley here from Loma Linda with the blessings of Dave Hinshaw and the understanding that we were probably going to be making a commitment on part of Loma Linda for a period of time because they were requiring a certain amount of staffing in critical areas. We could not provide that. Saigon Adventist Hospital. We didn't have the adequate staff, so we had to depend on Loma Linda. The next morning, I looked out Harvey's office, and there on the bulletin board, I saw a letter. And the letter is right here. This is the original letter. I eventually took it off the bulletin board and kept it. Not realizing the import that this letter would have a short time later. Let me read it to you. It was dated 7 April 1975, addressed to Harvey Rudisale, the administrator. Dear Mr. Rudisale, I find it quite difficult to adequately express my personal gratitude and that of my people for the superb medical attention given to the surviving victims of the recent air tragedy that deprived us of so many of our friends and the children that they were trying to help. But for the professionalism, devotion, and determination of your staff, that tragedy might have been total in its consequences. Please accept our undying thanks and our continued good wishes for your continued help to this community. Signed, gratefully, H.D. Smith, Major General, USA Defense Attaché. I thought that was a nice letter. Took the letter, put it aside, didn't think anything more about it. But it will play a role in a short time. So the situation in April was what you saw on the screen. That's how desperate it was. Everyone in Vietnam believed that the only place of safety would be in Saigon, the capital of the South. It was a terrible mistake that many of the refugees made. They'd been better off staying in their rural homes. But they found every possible means of transportation, from boats, from ferries, from carts, to jeeps, to buses. Is my mic out? Oh, man, I hate this. Can I take this off? Leave it on? Anyway, where was I? So we were looking at pictures, and you saw them too, of this young man that climbed to the nose wheel of an airplane leaving Da Nang, heading to Saigon. He climbed into that nose wheel, hoping that he could somehow get inside there and escape. He fell to his death. It was a sad chapter. So now we're at the C-5A crash. This is April. Things are really getting serious now. It is obvious that the country cannot hold together much longer. But I have other responsibilities. We have 5 other hospitals. We have 3 publishing houses. We've got basically 9 countries to take care of. So I had to go back to Singapore and look after some of the other responsibilities. And I remember now on April 18, we had organized a retreat for the union staff, an opportunity for us to get together for a weekend, get away for a weekend, and just rest and allow God to just nourish us. So we'd gone to a little place called Mersing, up the coast of Malaysia, East Malaysia. And it was Friday afternoon. About 4 or 5 o'clock, a message came to me. It was from the division president, my boss. And he said, we're calling a meeting of the division committee in my office tonight at 7:30. We need you there. Now, Pastor Randy, how often do they call conference committees on a Friday night? It doesn't happen. The church doesn't work that way. And so I realized I had no choice. I had to make my way back. So Pat and I got in the car and drove back to Singapore. I walked into the division president's office, and there was the committee gathered. And the reports that were coming back to us from Saigon and from the hospital were very disconcerting. There was a discussion about whether we should even continue to keep the hospital open any longer, or whether we shut it down. How about the rest of the staff? How many staff do we need to have? How many? And it was obvious that there was turmoil. There was questions between Loma Linda and the hospital administrators, and the hospital administrators and the church leaders and the division. And so there was a lot of confusion. And the push was for closing the hospital down. But we had an agreement with the United States government. We couldn't just unilaterally shut the hospital down. We had other commitments. And so we kicked it around for maybe an hour or two, and finally a decision was made. Well, we have to get back into Saigon. Someone needs to go back first of the week. I knew it was my responsibility. I said, I'll go. One of the other division officers, a man by the name of Don Roth, he says, I'll go with you. Now, we lived in Singapore, lived in the tropics. And what I've got on, what you see here, is nothing fancy, but it's just a simple safari suit. And this is what I would wear much of my time all through Southeast Asia. Lightweight, it's comfortable. I can meet government officials with it, and so it serves a purpose. So I had on my safari suit, grabbed my garment bag, and this briefcase. This is the actual briefcase. It's an old American Tourister. They don't even make them anymore, I don't think. It's a relic, but I'll never let that go. It's a part of me. And I went out to the airport. I kissed Pat goodbye, and I said, now, I'm going to be back on Wednesday afternoon. We have union committee Thursday morning. We have college board in the afternoon, and we have a hospital board Thursday night. So I will have to come back on Wednesday. Then I'll return back to Saigon if needed. And Pat's last words to me were, you better be prepared to stay longer. You better be prepared to stay longer. I didn't think much of it at the time, but she was insightful. So we went up on Sunday. Don Roth and I, we had meetings with the government officials, trying to figure out what we were going to do, what needed to be done, how we were going to phase things down. We knew we needed to get the size of the staff down. At the 1st of April, we had 37 expatriates working in the Saigon Adventist Hospital. 37. So we had to quickly Just bring that group down till finally, that last week we decided maybe we should not have more than 4 or 5 medical personnel here. And so we met with the leaders of the government. We discussed this with Dr. Dustin and said, you know, we're going to probably have to close this hospital down within a week or 10 days. We need to develop a system of how we're going to get the patients out of here and what kind of a facility will we run. We need to provide health care for the Americans. We understand that. We will only be able to provide the basic kind of health care. So you need to understand that and get that word out. And so we had these discussions, and again, we were trying to find out from them what were the plans to help evacuate the Saigon, the employees of the Adventist Hospital. Now let me back up and tell you the rationale for this. The employees of Saigon Adventist Hospital were at risk. You wouldn't think that. Why? Why would they be at risk? The mission president, the conference president, as we would call him here, the leaders, why would they be at risk? Those leaders would travel to Bangkok and to Singapore and attend meetings of the Union Committee and other boards, working closely with Seventh-day Adventist church leaders. And 3 years before we signed the agreement to provide health care for the Americans living in the country, for high-valued Vietnamese, for third country national leaders from other embassies, and employees of government contractors. But our primary purpose for running the hospital was still, and we made it very clear, we were there to provide health care primarily to the people of Vietnam. That was our primary purpose. These others were additional. Now, you're going to smile when I tell you why this was a problem. Where is the headquarters and the capital of the United States? Where is it located? Yeah, everyone knows that, Washington, D.C. Where are the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Washington, D.C. So you see in the minds of a communist leader or leader of an Islamic country, when they find out that we're with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in their thinking, they believe that we are spies many times. I've had government officials in communist countries tell me directly to my face, we don't believe you. We don't believe that you are simply a churchman or that you're simply with ADRA. We believe that you are involved with the government. And I tried to convince them, had to convince them, no, that's not the case. I'm a citizen of the United States, but I do not represent the United States. But because of this connection, the contract that we had with the government, with this hospital, the employees of the Saigon Adventist hospitals, many of them were on the hit list of the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong knew who they were. Okay, Nip, you're working there, and you're working there, and you're working on the staff there, you're one of the attendants, you're a nurse there. They knew. They knew the mission officers. They knew all of them. They knew the pastors. And I knew for a fact, through underground telltale, that the president of the conference, Pastor Lê Khong Yao, was on the hit list. He knew it. I knew it. The Vietnamese leaders knew it. That if Saigon fell and he was captured, he would probably be executed. That's how it was. So you can see they were concerned about what are the plans to help get us out of here. We faithfully stood by our post of duty, providing health care for the Americans in this country, for the embassy, for USAID, for other embassies. What about us? We don't see any concrete plans. So this was the argument, this was the hassle that I was having, and those of us from the division and from the union office having constantly with the government officials. And you can understand why. So on Monday, there were others that arrived. Now this was Sunday. On Monday, there were others that had arrived from Singapore, from the union office, one from the division office. By this time, there was a fair group meeting there. We had different duties that we had to tend to in order to keep things together and try to figure out what we were going to do if things went from bad to worse. We prayed a lot. We prayed a lot. We were on our knees begging for God's wisdom, for judgment, for discernment. Lord, how do we get through this? What is your plan? What do you have in mind for us, for your people, for your leaders? Lord, we want to make the right decision. We do not want to make the wrong decision. And so now we're down to a nucleus of about 8 or 9 expatriates. I see one of them here tonight, Dr. Jim Simpson. He and Bruce Branson had come over just a couple of weeks before to help out with the hospital, the surgery. Others had left, and so this was sort of the A team that had come to help out. We had Dr. and Mrs. George Wiseman. Some of you know them. George and Jean Wiseman. They had been in Bangkok for many years, and now were helping us in Saigon. They had been there for some time. And so this was our group of physicians, 3 physicians, Jean Wiseman, hospital administrators. Royce Thompson was there. He was our hospital administrator for the union, looked after the 6 hospitals. We had Romy Gaynor there, the chief financial officer, the treasurer, who worked closely with me over these years. And so this was the group that had to make some very difficult decisions. Monday night, we were told there was going to be an address by the president of the country, President Tu. So we all gathered around a television set to watch and to see what he was going to say. I had a running commentary by a very good friend of mine, bilingual, who could give me a commentary of what the president said. His speech went on, it seemed like forever. At the end of his speech, he announced that he was resigning as the president of the country, effective immediately. Now that threw the country into real turmoil. The president resigns, and he resigns on the basis that he was asked to fight a heavyweight championship fight with his arms chained behind him. The North Vietnamese were getting help from the Chinese, they were getting help from the Soviets, but the United States government, we kept the commitment that we made in Paris, and we no longer provided any more assistance to the South Vietnamese because Kissinger and the government officials wanted to phase this thing out. So the South Vietnamese military was getting virtually no help other than what they had already. Well, that wasn't much of a fight. It wasn't much of a fight. The North just came down pell-mell. They came up from the South. They came from the West. Soon, the city of Saigon was cordoned off. They built a barricade, basically, around the city. There were 16 divisions of the Viet Cong army on the outskirts of Saigon. You can see why the refugees were frightened. And they were now keeping out the refugees from coming into Saigon. Only those that could get into Saigon now would have to verify that they had relatives living in Saigon that could take care of them. So thousands and tens of thousands were turned away. The city was in pandemonium. It's chaos. So they slapped a curfew on. They slapped a curfew on from 8 p.m. in the evening until 7 a.m. in the morning. Nobody, no one dares go out in the streets. And they meant business. In the daytime, it was another story. There were thousands of people that would gather shortly after 7 a.m. right at the entrance into the airport. Big barricaded area with guards, very heavily armed guards, and no one could get into those gates without the proper permission. But thousands were hoping that they could, so they were blocking the entire area there. Now our hospital, Saigon Adventist Hospital, was located on the outer circle with the entrance into that airport. Great location. It had been known as the 3rd Field Hospital. It was a U.S. military hospital. It was the best equipped U.S. military hospital in Asia. And at the time that they asked us to take over providing health care for the Americans living in the country, the United States government said, oh, by the way, you can have this hospital with all of the equipment, with all of the supplies, everything. It's yours. That's what we were taking. That's what we were running. So we had that hospital, we had the old hospital, and we had the hospital that was under construction. Quite a responsibility. So Tuesday was pandemonium in Saigon. Traffic, terrible. So we realized that we could not do a lot during the day. We did our best to get around, and we would always use an ambulance. In most cases, we would use an ambulance. If we had to go down to the embassy, we used an ambulance. If we had to go to some other part of town, we used an ambulance. The hospital had a number of ambulances that were available for us to use. During curfew at night, it was a piece of cake. There was nobody on the streets. Nobody on the streets. The only vehicle you'd meet in the street would be an armored vehicle, military, and perhaps an ambulance, probably ours. And we did business at night. So every night that week, I would go down to the U.S. Embassy. I'd go to the ambassador's office, and either his secretary or his assistant, I would get on the hotline, and I would call the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. I made the call at 10 o'clock at night. For at 10 o'clock at night in Saigon, it was 10 a.m. at the General Conference. And so I would have a chance to talk with Dwayne Johnson, Pastor Dwayne Johnson. He was our liaison with Asia. So I would visit with him. I would tell him what was going on. I'd tell him an update, who had left, who had gone, where they'd gone to Bangkok, had they flown to Hong Kong, or they flying back to the U.S., who was still remaining in Saigon. And I said, you please notify the appropriate families and our offices, which he would do. And we would counsel back and forth. And he kept asking me, Ralph, how much longer? How much longer? I said, Dwayne, we have no way of knowing. We don't know. We're trying to get information from the government. They won't give us any information. He said, well, you got to get some information. I said, we have tried, Dwayne. I have met with the ambassador, the deputy ambassador. I have met with the political officers. By the way, the term political officer, when you hear that in foreign countries, when it relates to the United States government, political officer, you can just about bet CIA. CIA. So we were meeting with the political officers whenever we had a chance to, but it was very difficult to get to them. And in many times it was double talk. Well, this might be the case, or this might be the situation, or it may be that this is the way things will go down. Terribly frustrating. But we knew that the city was surrounded. We had been told that Saigon, in the terms of a military officer, one of the generals said that Saigon is a ripe plum, ready for the Viet Cong to walk in at any moment and take possession of it. And here we were in the center of that, not knowing whether tonight they would walk in and we would all be prisoners. We didn't know. We couldn't get the truth of the matter. Now, Wednesday. This is the day I go back to Singapore. I'm uneasy because of what's taking place. Feel a little bit ill at ease. But I knew I have to get back for these important meetings, and so I was asked to have worship that morning. And so the Vietnamese leaders gathered together at the chapel that we had at the hospital. There were probably 45 or 50 that were there, those that could get away from the hospital, publishing house, and the conference office. And I thought about, what do I say? What can I say to them? How can I give them any assurance when I don't have it? How can I tell them everything's going to work out when I have not the slightest idea? And now this becomes a problem for me when I have to hold this mic and look up my passage of my Bible to read what I want to read. So I'm going to have to just tell you where the text is. You can go look at it. It's 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, verse 8 and 9. And then Jeremiah 32, verses 26 and 27. So I talked about the writings of Paul, about how we were persecuted and pushed down and thwarted on every side. But somehow, through it all, God will find a way for his people. And then I turned to the passage in Jeremiah, where God says to Jeremiah, "Behold, Jeremiah, I am the God of all mankind. Is there anything too what? Hard for me?" That's how I ended it up. And I said, we have to take God at his word. God is faithful. He knows what's best. I wish I could tell you, but I can't. I don't know. Went to the embassy one more time, see if I had any more information, none given, so I headed out to the airport. One of my colleagues from the division office was on that same flight with me, and so we went through, got our boarding passes, went through the immigration and customs and waited a while, and finally boarded the flight. And we sat there, and there was no air conditioning on those planes. Some of you have traveled in the tropics and know what I'm talking about. Third world countries, no air con. It's 100 degrees humidity, 100% humidity, and probably in the 90s temperature-wise. So we're sat there and just soaking up. Finally, there's an announcement that comes over the PA. We're sorry to announce that the plane has some mechanical difficulties, and we will have to ask all of you to disembark at this point in time. So all for 180 of us or whatever, the 727, I can remember that, the 727 Air Vietnam, we got off, we go back into the terminal. And I'm feeling uneasy. Something just isn't quite right. And I find the station manager for Air Vietnam. Now, I knew him pretty well. He probably thought that I lived in Saigon because he saw me coming in and out of there all the time. And I motioned for him to come over. He came over. He spoke good English. I said, "Sir," I said, I've got a problem. He said, "What is it?" I said, "I have got to get back to the hospital." You know Saigon? Oh, yes. I said, "I got to get back to that hospital. There's some issues there that need to be taken care of. Please, can you find a way of getting me out?" He said, "But you have cleared immigration. You have cleared customs. You can't just simply walk away." I said, "Find a way for me, please." So we talked for a little bit. He finally motioned me. He says, "Follow me." So we walked outside the terminal building, out to the edge, down that would be the south edge, down by the building to where the barbed wire fence was located. High security. There was a little gate. He looked around. He says, "I'm going to let you out." I said, "When do we need to be back?" He said, "You need to be back here by 1:30. I said, "Sir, we will be back here by 1:30. So Jerry, Bruce, and I walked out, grabbed a taxi, went back to the hospital. The staff were eating lunch. There was discussion about what was going on, what the latest information from the embassy and the political people and what have you. And it was not looking good. The picture was getting more bleak as time went on. And there were still no plans for the evacuation of our people. And the government had promised this 3 years before. It seemed that the doors were being slammed shut right in our face. What a hopeless and helpless feeling it was. Time for it to get back to the airport, and I'm feeling uneasy about it. We go back. And I know I can't go through immigration again. They know that I've already left. And so I can't show my passport, so I have to go into the terminal, and I finally find the station manager, and I motioned to him, and he recognized the dilemma, and so he motioned for me to go around the side. So I walked around the side to the gate where he came from the other side and met me. He opened the gate, and he says, yeah, it's about boarding time. You might want to stand here for a few minutes, and when you see the people boarding, you just cut into the line and get on the plane. So that's what we did. Now we're ready to fly, finally. We wait. 30 minutes, an hour. By this time, we are so tired of sitting there. Everyone else is upset. This time, the pilot comes out. He grabs the microphone, and he said, I am very sorry. You like those words? I am very sorry, but this plane will not be going to Singapore. This plane will be going to Bangkok. So those of you that are on this flight, if you will please disembark. There will be a plane coming in later this evening from Hong Kong, and that is the flight that will take you to Singapore. Now what do? It's about 3:30 in the afternoon. I go back into the terminal. I look all around. I wave. Finally, I see the man. I wave at him. He comes to me, and he's sort of shaking his head. He knows what I'm going to ask him. I said, sir, I need your help. Please, can you help us? He motioned, just follow him around. Walk around to the gate. This time he's looking around. Make sure nobody spies what he's doing. Opens the gate. We walk out, grab a taxi, head back to the hospital. And so I gathered with the group that had just come back from the embassy or from the defense attaché. By the way, let me describe to you. As you would go into the airport, Tan Son Nhut Airport, on the right-hand side was what they referred to as MAC-V. Any of you guys in the Vietnam have heard that word? MAC-V. That was Pentagon East. It was a huge complex. It went for blocks from the entrance into the airport all the way down to where the terminals were. It had everything. It had gymnasium, bowling alley, swimming pool, you name it. That's where our generals were working. Comfort, wouldn't you say? And the guys out in the battlefield were losing their lives. So MAC-V. We're getting reports. I'm feeling uneasy. Something is not right. Something is not right. And I finally decided I'm going to go up to my little apartment that the hospital had for me, right across a little alley. So you shoot across the alley, and you go up the steps, and there was a little apartment. There's a quadruplex, and one of those was mine. So I started to walk up the steps, and coming down the steps was one of our employees, a guy I knew well. It was Eugene Domke. Eugene Domke was in charge of the maintenance of that entire plant. It's a big, complex plant. He was in charge of that. And then all of a sudden it hit me. Eugene Domke is Canadian. His embassy shut several days ago. How does he get out? How does he get out of Vietnam? Then I said, Gene, how quickly can you be ready to leave? Leave where? Leave Saigon. Where am I going? So you're going to Singapore. Well, I don't have any ticket. I said, don't talk to me. Just how quick can you get ready? 15 or 20 minutes? So meet me at 6 o'clock. I was told to be back at the airport by 6:30. 6 o'clock, meet me in the alley. 6 o'clock, he met me. The ambulance swung around. I got in. Eugene Domke got in. We drove out to the airport. Now I had a real task. I had to find that station manager because he was critical. Finally, I spotted him, and he came over to me. I said, can I talk to you a minute? Yeah, stepped aside. I said, sir, I really now have a serious problem. He said, what is it? I said, I'm not going back to Singapore. You have to go. You've already cleared immigration and customs. You got your boarding pass. I said, I can't go. I cannot go. What are you going to do? I said, this gentleman's going to go. Well, he hasn't gone through immigration or customs. I know that. But I said, there's a way you can help us. All right. So I followed him around the edge of the building up to the gate. It's getting towards dark now. He doesn't want to take any chances. He glances around. He opens the gate. I pull out my boarding pass and I give it to Eugene Domke. And I said, Gene, when they start boarding, jump on. And so he did. Now, I made perhaps the greatest mistake of my life at that juncture. Because you see, earlier that day, and I didn't realize it until I got back to the hospital, earlier that day, I had checked my garment bag in to Singapore. All my clothes, everything. I got back to the hospital and all of a sudden it hit me, oh man, Ralph, your clothes are all on their way to Singapore. And all I had on was this thing here. This, by the way, every time I wear it, Pat washes it. And when I put it back on, I say, honey, what's going on? This thing keeps shrinking. And she said, oh, no, Ralph, that's not the problem. But all I had when I got back with the clothes on me that you see right now, and this little attaché case. Fortunately, it had my toilet kit in there, my passport, my Bible, and other papers. And that was it. This was all I had. Now, I want to ask you a question. Where in Saigon am I going to go to a clothing store that's going to have clothes that's going to fit a man of my size? It isn't going to happen. So I realized at that point in time, I'm married to this suit of clothes. Pat went out to the airport expecting to meet me. She met Jerry Bruce, whom she recognized, another man walking down the corridor with him. And unfortunately, all she got was my garment bag. And she took that home. I realized then there was a reason that I needed to stay behind. I had felt uneasy all day getting on that plane. Something isn't right. Something isn't right. Something isn't right. Speaking to me, speaking to me, speaking to me. When I got back to the hospital, then I knew I was here to the end. I wasn't leaving. But I had made plans temporarily to go back on Thursday morning. There was a flight scheduled early Thursday morning. I thought, well, maybe I'll take that flight and head back to Singapore. Next morning, I did a crazy thing. I went up to the airport. I thought, well, I still need to get back for these important meetings. I went back to the airport. Airport's basically empty. I see the station manager standing there by himself. I walk up. I said, what's going on? He said, haven't you heard? Heard what? At midnight last night, this airport was closed to all commercial flights. There are no other flights except military flights. I went down to the embassy Wednesday night. And I was determined that I was not going to leave the embassy until I got some answers. And so I contacted one individual after another. I contacted Boudreaux, and I contacted Lehman. I contacted one of the assistants to the political officers. And as I tried to get information from them, they were skipping off, saying they had to go upstairs to a high-level meeting at the ambassador's room. Now, here's what was going on. Here's what we were caught in the middle of, and I didn't realize at that moment. We were caught in the middle of a dispute between the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, and the United States government. This tug of war had been going on for a number of days. The ambassador was not allowing anyone to leave Vietnam. He didn't want the Americans to leave. He didn't want the high-valued Vietnamese to leave. He didn't want anyone to leave. So the planes, many of the planes were leaving half empty. And the reason for it, his argument was that if the Viet Cong marched into Saigon and there was a loss of American lives, the United States would get back into the middle of this war and obliterate the North. That was his argument. So let's keep the Americans here. Let the Viet Cong come in here. Let there be a loss of American lives, and the United States will come back into the conflict. Unfortunately, he did not read the tea leaves very well. There was absolutely no appetite for that argument in the United States at that time. They didn't want anything to do with the war in Vietnam. Enough is enough. Let's get out of here. And so this argument was going on between him and Kissinger, and finally the president, until he was overruled. And Admiral Morrison, the highest ranking admiral there in the fleet, came in by helicopter to tell Ambassador that he had to get off of the embassy, get out of the embassy with him and fly back to the ship. Ambassador said, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not going. Unless I hear it from Secretary Kissinger or President Ford, I'm not leaving the embassy. Well, it wasn't long before he got the word. And it came down pretty fast. Mr. Ambassador, your work is done. Your work is finished. We didn't know this. We didn't know this conflict was going on, this tug of war was going on, and we're caught in the middle of it. So the U.S. government is saying, get the employees out of there, get the staff out of there, get the Americans out of there, get the high-value Vietnamese out of the country. And he is stonewalling and said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And so we're caught in this tug of war, and that's why we couldn't get any good answers. So Wednesday night, I'm down at the embassy, and I catch one of these guys. I have the name here right now. Courier. Guy by the name of Courier. He's a political officer. He was the only one I could finally get to take a few minutes to talk to me. So I finally had this visit with him. I said, Mr. Courier, I need the stark truth. As unpleasant as it is, I want you to give it to me. I need to know now. What is going on? How much longer? How long do you anticipate Saigon can hold out? How long will it be before the Viet Cong come in? What plans are there to get the Americans, the rest of the Americans, and the Vietnamese, high-value Vietnamese, out of the country? These were the questions I put to him. He said, Mr. Watts, I wish I could tell you. I know there's a big debate that's going on, but I can't give you any answers. I said, I want you to tell me what you think. Don't give me any of the garbage that the government wants to give to us that we've been getting these last few weeks. I want to know the unvarnished truth. I need to know the unvarnished truth now. I said, are there any plans underway that you know of at this moment in time to get our Vietnamese employees out of the country? Saigon hospital employees, mission employees, any plan to get them out? He shook his head. He says, I'm sorry to tell you, in spite of what you've been told, there are no plans. I said, so these employees are not considered high value? The doctors that I have here, he said, no, don't worry about the Americans. We'll get them out. I said, I'm not worried about the Americans. I know we'll get them out. I'm worried about the Vietnamese who have stood shoulder to shoulder with us all this time. I need to know that they're going to be able to get out. I can't give you that assurance. I said, are we considered high value? Are we at the top of the list? He says, no, you're not even at the top of the list. I said, then what do we do? He says, I wish I could help you. There's only one thing I can tell you. What's that? He says, you better find a way to get your people out of the country. Man, what a load. I had been told that there was a man that President Ford had asked to be the coordinator to get the high-value Vietnamese out of the country. He had lived and worked in Vietnam as a contractor, knew Vietnam well, knew the Vietnamese people well, and so he had been tapped by the government to do this as an outsource. He did this. He was working out of MACV, the Pentagon West, out of the Defense Attaché's office. And I was told that the only hope that we had was possibly to find him. I said, what's his name? His name is Johnson. I left the embassy and I made my way back. Stopped at the hospital, talked to a few of the leaders for a while, gave them a report on what I'd been told. And by the way, Mr. Courier told me when I nailed him, I said, how much longer do you think the South can hold out? He said, Mr. Watts, 5 or 6 days at the most. Wow. We had so much to do. So I decided I got to go to the Defense Attaché's office, see if I can find Johnson. And I drive into this area where there's this huge complex, and I come back to the main entrance. There are Marine guards there, of course, to protect it. And I pulled up in the ambulance, and I waited. And I was told that he would probably be showing up a little later on in the evening. I saw a car pull up. It was a black vehicle. The back door opened up, and I see this man get out. And when I look at him, I'm saying, this cannot be Johnson. This man, as I got closer to him, had a shirt that he'd been wearing for a couple days. His pants were all wrinkled. He was sweat-stained. And I went up to him, and I thought to myself, this cannot be the man that the president has signed to this responsibility. So I blurted out, Mr. Johnson? Turned around, yes. I said, my name is Ralph Watts. I need to talk to you for a moment. And I could tell he was bone weary. 2 days growth of beard. Probably hadn't showered in a couple of days. I said, just a moment or two. I need your help. I really need your help. He said, what is it? I said, are you acquainted with Saigon Adventist Hospital? Oh, yes. I know the hospital well. I said, we've had this agreement with the government. Our employees' lives are endangered. You know that. Oh, yes, I'm aware of that. I need your help to get these employees, these key employees out. Well, what do you mean? I said, we have a group that we need to get out, the employees, the board members and others. He said, well, how many are you talking about? I said, it could be 125, it could be 150 or more. He said, Mr. Watts, he said, I don't have authority to grant a group like that. He said, I've let groups of 15 or 20 go, but nothing like that. I said, please, sir, I beg of you, do what you can for us. Please help us. He said, I can't do anything tonight. He says, come back at 11 o'clock tomorrow, see what we can do. So at 11 o'clock, we showed up. There was a note on his door. Said, I'll be back at 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. So we left. 1 o'clock, we're there. 1:15, 1:30. Finally, we see him coming down the steps. He walks right past us, over to his door, unlocks the door, walks in, and sits down behind his desk.
And he stretches. He had those same shirt and trousers on that I'd seen the night before. I knew he was bone weary. He said, "How many do you have on your list?" I said, "Well, we have a pretty large list." Now, let me tell you what had happened. On Wednesday night, when I got back from seeing him, I called the Vietnamese leaders together from the hospital and from the mission. There were probably about 6 or 8 that had gathered there together, maybe more. And I said to them, after meeting Johnson for the first time that evening, I said, I have the most difficult assignment you will ever have to have. What is that? I said, I have just met with Johnson. I don't know whether he'll approve it or not, but he said he'd be willing to entertain a list of names. How many names will she put down here? I told him that it could be as high as 175. So he said, "Well, Mr. Watts, what do you want?" I said, "I want you, this group tonight, to make up that list." Pastor Yao looked at me, shook his head. He said, "Pastor Watts, that's like asking us to be God. You're asking us to decide who's going to live, who's going to die." I said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I can't do it. Missionaries can't do it. You leaders, you have to decide who would be the highest priority, who would be most likely to be in the most amount of danger. You'll have to make the list." So they went to work all night long. 8 o'clock the next morning, I'm at the office. They had not left. And I said to Pastor Yao, the president, I said, "Do you have the list?" "Yes, we have the list." And I said, "Can you please give me the list?" Hand me the list. So I opened it up and I started turning the pages. 6, 8, 10. I said, "Yao, how many names are on this list?" "Oh, Pastor Watts, you don't know how we agonized all night long. We just agonized. We prayed and we thought and we..." "Pastor Yao, how many names are on this list?" "Oh," he says, "you can't believe how much we agonized. We cried. We wept. We just could not cut that list down. Pastor Yao, how many are on the list?" And he looked up, tears in his eyes, and he said, "Pastor Watts, we couldn't get the list less than 225. Oh. I said, "What are you thinking?" I was upset. "What are you thinking? What's wrong? You know that we probably don't have the possibility of getting that large a group. What do you expect? What are you expecting?" And then he turned to me and he said, "Elder Watts, you remember the worship you had yesterday?" "Yeah." "You remember the text you gave at the end in Jeremiah? Where the Lord speaks to Jeremiah and says, 'Behold, I am the Lord of all mankind. Is there anything too hard for me?'" He said, "Pastor Watts, all we are asking is let's pray and please beg them to do something for us." So I took that list and I put it in this case. And I headed to see Johnson. So finally, in the afternoon, we finally get to see him. And he wants to know what I wanted to know just a few hours earlier. As he looked that file folder, opened the pages, turned the pages, he said, "Mr. Watts, how many names are on this list?" "Mr. Johnson, I'm terribly embarrassed. I have to tell you, I gave strict orders to our staff last night not to exceed 170. How many names are on this list, sir?" And I said, "Well, they did their best. They worked all night long and they agonized. And, I said, you don't know how difficult it was for them. How many names are on this list? I need to know." I said, "Mr. Johnson, there are 225 names." Oh. He said, I don't know. I don't know. I said, Mr. Johnson, all we can plead for is do your best. Do your best. And so he left. He says, I'll have to go upstairs. I'll have to make contacts with the high officials here and perhaps even the U.S. I said, what time do you want us back? Be back here at 3 o'clock. Fine. Some went back to the hospital. I stayed by. And we waited. And we waited. And I'm pacing that corridor. Here's this big military complex, shredded paper everywhere, file cabinets open, everything is deserted, it's empty, and you could hear the sound of the footsteps as I walked up and down this corridor. Deep within my thoughts, there were two of us there. I don't think we said two sentences to each other. We just paced back and forth, praying that God would intervene. Please, Lord, intervene in our behalf. $3:00. No Johnson. 3:15. 3:30. I hear steps coming down, footsteps coming down from the second floor. I looked into the eyes of Johnson immediately to see if I could find any indication of what the decision was. He had no expression on his face. He walked right past us, down to his office, took out his key, opened the door, sat behind his desk, slapped the file folder on top of the desk. And he leaned back. He said, well, here's your file with the list. I said, Mr. Johnson, I have to know. We need to know. Has our request for this number of Vietnamese to leave, has it been granted to us? He said, well, I have a note for you. And here's the note. I have it. It'll be with me the rest of my life. It's dated 24 April 1975, to whom it may concern. The attached manifests are dependent of individuals who have been closely associated with U.S. forces. Because of this close association with us, their lives may be endangered. Please expedite their departure. Signed, H.D. Smith, Major General, United States Defense Attaché. Can you believe that? Do you believe in miracles? I want you to know that every time I think of this, my heart is full. Because what it says to me is, God is faithful. Those 36 hours were the most traumatic hours of my life. Didn't get any sleep to speak of. Didn't eat a whole lot. Stressed out. And in prayer. I was so overjoyed with what Johnson gave me that I had the inclination to reach down and hug him. But I didn't think he would appreciate it, and I knew it wouldn't be good. So I said to him, does this say what I think it says? He says, yes. He says, I had to go upstairs. I appealed to the general. He appealed to the embassy, and the embassy appealed to the United States government, and the word came back from Washington to grant the departure of these employees of the Adventist Church Hospital. So we went back. I called the little group of missionaries together. Jim was with us. We met in Dr. Jean George and Jean Wiseman's apartment. We met there at about 4 o'clock that afternoon. I told them what had happened, the results. But I said, don't say a word. We cannot say a word to anyone. None of the Vietnamese. I said, this is a secret kept just within the missionary family because there are things that have to be done. And so I had my assignment list here for what the expats were going to do. Thompson, Branson, and Simpson. They were to stay at the hospital and load the ambulances. Watson, Gaynor and Rudisale were to drive, and Wisemans would be out there to host the group. The reason for this, we had decided that we would not tell anyone until 7:45, because curfew began at 8 o'clock. And if the word had gone out, if I had said something to Pastor Yao or someone else at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, how many do you think would have showed up? 225 or 2,225. That's what would have happened. So not a word. Not a word. But the big work had to be done. The big job was to get all these names, all 225, on a manifest, because if their names weren't on a manifest, they could not get on an airplane. So what do we do next? So, well, we have to go back to the Defense Attaché office, and there in the gymnasium is the gentlemen that are responsible for getting the names of those that have been approved on the manifest list. Oh, my. I drove by, and there were a stream of people streaming out of that gym, out into the road and down the roadway. All of these people were in line to get their names on a manifest. Romy Gaynor was with me. I said, Romy, there's no way. It'll be 2 days before we'll get up to the desk. So I walked up to the side entrance of the gym, up at the front. There was a guard there. And I said to the guard, I said, can you tell me who's in charge of getting these names on the manifest? Yeah, he says, it's the man sitting at the center desk. I said, what is his name? His name is McGregor. McGregor. I said, well, I don't know whether he was a corporal and I called him a sergeant. Whatever it was, I gave him a promotion. And I said to him, I said, you know, I have a very important message for Mr. McGregor. Is there some way you can help me get into the side entrance? He said, sure. He said, just crawl under this rope. I'll open the door for you. So we did. The door was open. I saw this crowd of people in that gymnasium, 3 long lines. I headed right over to the center table. I waited until the people that were getting their names on the list were finished, and I turned to him. I said, Mr. McGregor, yes? My name is Watts. I'm with the Saigon Adventist Hospital. The United States government has just given permission for us to get our people on these evac flights as soon as possible, and I need your help. He said, well, can you hand me the list of names that you have? Thinking that I'd pull out a list out of my pocket and give it to him. I handed him a file folder. Looked at that file folder. He said, wow. He said, how many names are in that file folder? I almost said to myself, sir, you don't want to know. And I said, sir, there's only 225 names on that list. Oh, my. He said, this is going to take a long time. I said, look, let me make a suggestion. I'll sit down here, and my colleague will sit on the other side, and we will help you put these names on the manifest. You just give us the paper, and we'll do it. I said, now we're dividing this group of 225 into 8 groups. 8 groups. There are 8 Americans that will be in a group, and each one will be responsible for about 25 or 30. So that would be Gene Wiseman, 25 or 30, George, Dr. Simpson, Bruce, Rudisale, Thompson, Gaynor, Watts. I said, that's how it'd be. I said, but I have one request for you. He said, what's that? I said, Dr. and Mrs. Wiseman. I said, they need to be on the same airplane. I said, can we make it so it'll work out that way? Yeah, I said, there's no reason why we can't do that. Now, there's a reason for this, because a few days earlier, I had tried to convince Jean Wiseman to leave the country. She was the only woman with our group left. And I said, Jean, things could get really tough here. It could be very erratic. It could be, we could find ourselves in a war situation. I'd feel much better if you were not having to face that. So he said, if you know Gene Johnson, you know what I'm talking about. Gene Wiseman, you know what I'm saying. Gene looked at me. She pointed her finger at my chest. She says, Ralph, I've been with George all these years, and I'm not leaving him now, and he's not leaving me now. So I'm going to stay here, and you don't need to worry about me. I'll be just fine. Now, I knew Gene Wiseman because we had worked in Bangkok together. And if you know Gene Wiseman, you'd know, yeah, she'll be just fine. So I made the McGregor promise to get them both on the same flight. He promised to do that. She hasn't forgiven me to this day because they were not on the same flight. She was on an earlier flight, and he got bumped off because of some higher value Vietnamese people, and they were on that flight with Gene and went to the Philippines. And George came later. Now our big job began. We had the lists made up. The manifests were there. Now to get our folk together. How are we going to get 225 people together in such a short time? So at 7:45, I called together our Vietnamese leaders, and I said to them, we have received permission from the government for the entire group of 225. Oh, they were jumping up and down. Praise God. They were so excited. I said, let's celebrate later. I said, now we've got a lot of work to do. I said, curfew begins at 8. We need to get everybody that's on that list into the airport, to the staging area, into the hospital, into the staging area. And we need to do it by shortly after 8, 8:15, 8:30. The first ambulance, leave at 8:30. And I said, furthermore, everyone that's on their list need to say their goodbyes at home. They can't come here. The relatives can't come here. No, they need to say their goodbyes at home. And they cannot bring anything other than a light case. No suitcases, large suitcases, no duffel bags, only a hand carry. That's all. And so they left. What would be your reaction if all of a sudden you were told that you could leave? There were employees earlier in the week that were told they could get on an evac flight or on a medevac flight, and told while they were at the hospital, while they were still working at the hospital, by the way, arrangements have been made. If we can get you out to the airport, you can get on a plane right away and leave. There were scores of them that left the hospital, some in crutches, some were in casts, some in splints, all looking like they were medical cases. Go out to the airport, get on a plane, and they left. Nothing but with the clothes that they had on their backs. And so the first of the group to leave was at 8:30 that night. I drove the first ambulance. And Jim and the group getting the people into the ambulances, calling the names off, getting them in the ambulance. One ambulance after another, all during that evening. We made that list. Later in the evening, I had Pastor Yao come to me, and he was wringing his hands. And when he was wringing his hands, he was the conference president. I knew that there was a crisis of some kind. And he came up to me, and I said, what's wrong, Pastor Yao? He says, he said, there are two families who've been told that they were on the list. They showed up, and they're not on the list. What are we going to do? I said, there's nothing we can do now. Get their names and give them to me. Then later on, there were other groups that wanted to leave, needed to leave, and their names were given. I put them in my pocket right here. We began the process of getting the people from the hospital. Now, the biggest fear I had that night was that someone could possibly pull out a machine gun or a pistol and hold us all hostage. That was my biggest fear. And I prayed, please, Lord, no. We had armed guards. The embassy provides security guards, so we had good security at the hospital. Earlier in the day, they had to clear out the hospital. By the way, the patients that were in the hospital had been discharged or sent to other hospitals. There was only one patient that remained behind, an elderly lady who knew that she wasn't going to live long, and she says, I'm not leaving. So the hospital basically was an outpatient clinic for the last few days. But the time came when they had to leave. So one by one, our group made their way out to the airport. The planes, we were told, our group would be the first to leave, would be at around 6 o'clock in the morning. Finally, it was time for me to take the last group out, and that was Pastor Yao. I had the mission and the hospital administrators, the top key people, stay by till the very end. In case there was an incident, I wanted them there. We had 2 or 3 during the night. We had one incident where a couple of young men got in the ambulance and refused to get out. They were not on the manifest. We had to get them out of the ambulances. There are others that wanted to get on the list. We could not put them on the list. There just wasn't an opportunity to do that. But there were some at the last minute we were able to get on because of how critical their position would be. We could not take all the pastors. We could not take all the teachers, all the literature evangelists. There's no way. We didn't intend to do that. We only could take the high-valued, the ones that had this contact, made a main contact with the U.S. government. So Pastor Yao and his group were in the ambulance. We turned the corner, ready to head that long straightaway that takes us to the entrance into the airport, where they have a big barricade that requires an S-turn in order to get through. So you drive up, the officers, the military officials are there to check everyone, and then there's an S-turn that you have to negotiate before you're actually into the airport and the Pentagon East. We had just turned the corner when some spotlights brought us to a halt. I was driving the ambulance. The spotlight was on us. I stopped. An armored vehicle pulled right up to where we were. I got out, walked around to find out what was going on. Yao got out. And this colonel, looked like a colonel, started talking to Yao. And I started talking to him. And he was talking to Yao. And I kept talking to the officer, hoping Yao would translate for me. I had a suspicion of what was going on. Finally, Yao stuck his head into the ambulance, and he barked out some orders in Vietnam. And in a few moments, I saw some packages coming up. And I saw some envelopes coming up. And I saw some things that were in a little sack coming up to the front. And I said, Yao, no, we're not doing this. And I started to argue with the officer, and the officer was telling Yao. And Yao turned to me and he said, please, the officer's asking you if you wouldn't mind going back to the driver's seat and sitting down. And I think what Yao was basically saying to me very politely is, the colonel wants me to tell you to shut up and sit down. This is between the two of us. I think that's what was said, but I didn't understand the language. Anyway, it's all handed over to him. Yao gets in the car, and I said, I'm not leaving. We're not going to get held up like this. This is crazy. I said, Yao, we're not going to do it. He said, Pastor Watts, think of it this way. In a few hours, we will all be on a plane leaving this country for good. We'll be heading to the United States. What we have now, what possessions we have now, if we can leave them behind and make it better for these officers, wouldn't it be the best thing for us to do? This money is not going to do us any good the minute we leave this airport. Why didn't I think of that? Well, it made good sense. I said, will you tell the officer that we may have some more trips to make tonight, and I would appreciate not having this to deal with. So he did. I drove a couple more times. The family of these two families, I went back to the Defense City Civil. I went to the gymnasium. I went to the office, to the military police officer, walked under the rope, went into the building, walked over to McGregor's desk, pulled out a few pages of notes. He looked up at me. He said, "You have more?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed." He said, "Well," he said, "you have authorization, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I think we do." Well, I said, "Let's go ahead and put them on the manifest." So which flight do you want them on? I said, "Put them on mine." So we did that several times yet that night. Finally, the entire group at the airport, first airplane to leave shortly. At about 2:30 or 3 o'clock, drive back to the hospital for the last time. Just Gaynor and myself, Royce Thompson, Bruce, Jim, the others were out at the airport waiting for the groups to be called. I knew my group would not leave till later on in the morning. I wanted to make sure that I was the last to leave, and I wanted to make sure that our leaders were the last to leave, just in case there was an incident. Now go back, cross the little alleyway, walk up the steps to the little apartment that I have. And when I walk in there, I turned to Romy. I said, "Romy, I know you feel the same way as I feel. I've got to have a shower and wash these clothes. I had worn this for almost 2 days now in the tropics, all sweat stained." He said, "What are you going to do?" "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to wash my clothes." "What do you mean you're going to wash your clothes?" I said, "You watch." So I walked into the shower. I turned on the water with my clothes on, and I started lathering up my clothes. I was standing in that shower with that cool water flowing down on me, and I'm washing these clothes just the best I can. Then I take them off. I take my boxers off, and I wash them. Take my socks off, and I wash them. I wring them out the best that I can, except for this, and I wring out my boxer, put them back on. He said, "Now what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, find a way of drying this." So I looked we had an overhead fan. So in Asia, you just have overhead fans everywhere. I looked up I'm going to jury rig this thing somehow. So I found a hanger, and I put my garment bag on that hanger below the fan, went down, turned the fan up full, hoping that it could dry quickly. And I just saw it just dripping down to the terrazzo floor, and I said, "Oh, forget it. I'm going to bed." I was just bone tired. I plopped into bed and fell asleep immediately. And then all of a sudden, I heard the planes coming and going. And by the way, they were coming about every 15 or 20 minutes, night and day. C-130s, C-131s, C-140s, or 141s. Night and day. So you had the hum of, in the distance you could hear the guns and the mortar going off. You knew the Viet Cong were there. And all of a sudden I woke up. And I thought to myself, "My lands, Ralph, they've called your flight. What are you doing here? They've called your flight. What are you doing?" Fear struck me. And then the adrenaline just kicked in overdrive. And I looked at my watch. It was 3:20. I had been asleep about 20 minutes. You know what that's like. About 20 minutes. I'm pointing to a surgeon. I couldn't get back to sleep. Gaynor woke up. He said, "What's going on? What's going on?" I said, "I can't go back to sleep." I said, "We need to go back to the airport and see if everything's okay. Check on everybody." And then I remembered my garment bag in Singapore, and my safari suit hanging on that hanger up there, still dripping. Well, I walk off, take it off the hanger, and I put on this safari suit, soaking wet. And Gaynor says, "Man, you look crazy, man." I said, "Yeah." But I said, I have no other choice, because all I had was this and this. We head back to the airport. As soon as I get there, Yao comes running up to me again, wringing his hands. I said, "Pastor Yao, what's going on?" "Henry, are you here tonight?" "Henry." "Pastor Yao's son, where are you?" "Where?" "Sitting in the back." "That's Pastor Yao's son sitting in the back. He was with me in my group that was evacuated that day. Henry's a businessman, lives here in Southern California, wishes his father could be here, and I do too. But Henry, good to see you. Thanks for coming." So anyway, Yao comes running up to me, wringing his hands. He said, "Elder Watts, there's one family that's really critical that we get on the flight." I said, "Who is it?" He said, "Tron Chu." "Oh, Tron Chu." Tron Chu was a member of the conference committee and of the hospital board, our leading layman, our most affluent layman in all of Vietnam, operated a large factory with a lot of employees, had a beautiful house, well equipped, beautiful family. Tron Chu, Vietnamese Chinese. He's a marked man. He will be a marked man because of his association with us. Why haven't we thought about it? Why didn't we get his name on the list? I said, "Well, do you know the names of the family?" "Yes." "You give me the names of the family and I'll see what I can do. But you're going to have to call him. If I get permission, you'll have to let him know somehow." So I went back to see McGregor. He didn't even bother to hardly look up at me anymore. He said, "Here's the manifest. Let's get these names down." So he wrote the name. Which flight do you want? I said, "Put them on my flight." I went back. Yao found me. He said, "What's this?" I said, "Their names are on. You need to call Tron Chu at 6 o'clock in the morning, wake him up, and tell him to meet us at the entrance to the airport as curfew ends, 7 o'clock. He'll have to drive early morning hours." So Yao said, "Okay, I'll find a phone." He found a phone. And he called Tron Chu. Now I want to ask you a question. If you got a call at 6 a.m. in the morning telling you that provisions had been made for you to escape, would you do it? Would you do it? I'm sure he looked at his house. I'm sure he thought of his factory and his employees. I'm sure he thought about the wealth that he had. I'm sure he was wondering, what happens next? Must have gone through his mind. But I can picture him awakening his wife and his daughters and saying to them, "Hurry, quickly, get dressed, bring one small case." "Daddy, what are we doing?" "We're leaving. We're going to the airport." So at 7 o'clock, Yao and I were there at the entrance to the airport. For some reason, we missed Tron Chu. He slipped right in without even having to see the guards. They were exchanging guards perhaps at that time, but he slipped through. And Yao and I were out there waiting in the ambulance. Finally, I said, "Yao, we got to go." Just at that time, the officer from the security walked over to the ambulance. And he started talking to Yao. And Yao just shook his head. And Yao said to me, he says, "Oh, Pastor Watts, we made a terrible mistake." I said, "What is it?" "The manifest with my name on it is in the airport. We've left it with one of the missionaries there. I cannot go in. He won't let me. He won't let me." I said, please translate for me. So I explained to the officer that we'd been making this trip all night long, that he was a key member, key individual. His name was on the list, at the top of the list. I said, you have to let this gentleman in. He said, no, unless his name is on a manifest, he is not getting into this airport. And he ordered Yao out of the ambulance. I said to Yao, you stay right here. I said, we're going to head in there, get that manifest, and come back and pick you up. You stay right here. Don't you leave this spot. You stay here till the very end. Don't leave. So we got in the ambulance. Driver and I drove right in. No problem for an ambulance, particularly. He had his ID on, and I was an American. We only go maybe a couple hundred yards, and the driver says, oh. He said, no. I said, what do you want? Let's go back. Let's go back. And in broken English, he explained to me the reason he wanted to go back was that he thought it would be a better idea if Yao was driving the ambulance and he got off. I said, well, that sounds good to me. I said, go. So we rushed back. We drove back to the very spot where I had left Yao off, and he was nowhere in sight, and there were hundreds of people beginning to gather because curfew had ended. They were hoping to get into the airport. Panic. Oh, all of this, and we lose Pastor Yao. I said, no, please, Lord. After a few minutes, the driver touched my shoulder. He said, look. And I could see walking down the road, navy blue pants with a light yellow shirt. I could see the form of Yao. I said, let's go quickly. So we got in the ambulance, came up to where Yao screeched to halt. The driver explained to Yao what needed to be done, and Yao got in. We drove the big circle around, headed back right towards the barricades. As we were heading right to the barricades, Yao stopped. He said, no, Pastor Watts, this is not going to work. I said, what do you mean it's not going to work? I said, do you have a better idea? He said, yes. I said, what is it? He says, you drive the ambulance. He says, they won't think about stopping you. But he said, if they stop the ambulance and that same officer is there and I'm driving the ambulance and I have this man's ID on him, he says, they will take me off and there's nothing that can be done to get me in there. So I said, all right. So we switched places. He jumped in the passenger. I took the driver's seat. And then we started in. And then I backed the ambulance off, because I decided that ambulance was going to make the fastest S-turn it had made. And I backed it off and let the other vehicles proceed through. Finally, when I felt there was enough distance so I could give it enough acceleration, I would do it. And so I did. And we started rushing up towards that barricade. And I told Yao, I said, put your head down and look the other way. And so he did. He put his head down and he looked the other direction. And I came up to that S-turn, and I made the first turn to the right and then the turn to the left. I looked over to the left, and the officer that had taken Yao off was in conversation with another officer, and we slipped through into the airport. Yao was almost in tears. His wife and the wives of some of the other leaders had left a couple of days earlier with Don Roth and a group. They had agreed to stay by. The men had, if we could get the wives out. And I leaned over to Yao, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, Yao, we're almost there. And so the flights took off, one after another. Gene, George, Jim, Bruce, Royce, Harvey, Romy, and he was the last. Finally, they had called my group, pretty large group. We loaded the buses and went out to the tarmac. And we expected the plane to be coming in momentarily, and it was about noon. And then there was a lull. I didn't hear any more planes. It was quiet. I looked at my watch. Man, I'm getting anxious. 12:30, 1 o'clock, 1:15, and I think the country has capitulated. The South has surrendered. By the way, they had 2 additional presidents elected that week, the South Vietnamese. 3 presidents in 3 days. We're held hostage. We don't know it. Or has President Ford called off the evacuation? These thoughts were going through my mind. I kept saying, no, this cannot be. Finally, I looked up in the sky, eastern sky, and I saw a glint, the sun on metal. I watched. Wow. It's a plane. Could this be our plane? Now watch as that plane got lower, 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 till finally it touched down at the end of the runway, made its way up, made a quick turn, pulled right up in front of the tarmac, turned the plane, headed back out to the runway. Back hatch opened up. An officer, an Air Force officer, waved his hands like this, and all of us, 180 of us, ran pell-mell into that airplane as fast as we could go. Mothers with children, elderly, and one lone American. Jumped into that plane, they slammed the shut, pilot took off, and we headed to Guam. When we got to Guam, we had a major headache because we discovered that our Vietnamese were scattered all over the island of Guam in about 8 or 10 different camps. How are we ever going to find them? So these leaders, one by one, went out to these camps with a manifest list and began to ask, all right, anyone with this name here? And then they would know as a group, they would know who the group was, and they finally would identify themselves. It took a day and a half to do this. This was on Sabbath and on Sunday. On Monday, we finally had the final number. And the number that had evacuated during those last few days, that had been evacuated from Vietnam, was not 225. It was 410. 410. Many had left on the medevac flights and other flights, so they had left earlier. But all had ended up eventually in Guam. Now the challenge was, what do we do now? In order to get them out of Guam into the U.S., they had to have a sponsorship. Someone like you folk in this audience would say, okay, we'll take a family, we'll take a family, we'll take a family. And I thought to myself, 410, it'll take 410 years to get this all done. What are we going to do? And we talked about it and debated it. And we were in constant contact with Loma Linda, with Dave Henshaw and Hadley and the rest. And I had a conversation with Dave Henshaw. And I said, we're on the real horns of a dilemma here. He said, what is it? I said, we have to have a sponsorship for these people. We cannot get them out of here unless they're sponsored. That's critical. He said, Ralph, I'll get back to you in a little bit. A little bit. I'm on the phone with Dave Henshaw. And he says to me, Ralph, we've made a decision, which meant I've made a decision. Loma Linda is going to sponsor all 410. Loma Linda will sponsor 410. How good is our God? What a wonderful Lord we serve. Door after door after door slammed. And yet, time after time after time, God had the right man at the right time in the right place for us. Johnny Johnson. I talked to Johnny just a couple of weeks ago. He's 90 years of age, dying of cancer, living in Mississippi. I said, Johnny, I want to tell you one more time. You need to hear it from me. You were God's man at God's time, at the right time. Do you know that? God used you. God used you to help get our people out of the country. Oh, no. No, Dr. Watts. He always called me Dr. Watts. I said, no. By the way, he sends his best wishes. He says, I love the Adventist people. He was well acquainted with Adventists in Vietnam. Well acquainted with Pastor Yao. Didn't know it till later. Knew Saigon Adventist Hospital very well. Another miracle. So then, to get the group here, been sponsored, guaranteed by Loma Linda. Now remember, we left on Friday from Vietnam. On 1 week later, exactly to the day, we all left 400, almost to the 410, left on Friday, the 25th of April. 1 week later, on Thursday night, Ellsworth Wareham, Joan Coggin, I think Roy Jutzi, and a number of us drove down to the airport, the air base, Pendleton, and then on the coast, to the air base, the Marine Air Base, where 747s had come in and landed there with all 410 that had left Saigon. And buses were arranged to bring them from that camp up to the campus of this medical center and university. And so on Friday morning, we were there to greet them, and they drove up in these buses for the first time in the United States, all new to them, couldn't speak the language, weren't accustomed to the culture. All 410 plopped into the heart of Loma Linda University. Now, I want to tell you, there isn't a better place on earth where they could have landed than right here. Do you believe me? Do you hear me? Yes. Because the love and the compassion. Tents were set up for them for medical treatments. Tent was set up for them to have a food assistance and to get clothing and other toiletries. Gentry Gym was made into a dormitory. Mattresses were all over the floor, 410 of them. The gym was unbelievable to look at. What a sight. And the people of Loma Linda opened up their hearts and their love. They took them into their homes. Some kept them, some of them for years. They helped them with their education. Some of them were doctors that had come from, that are non-Adventists. By the way, I insisted that non-Adventists be on that list of 225. Would you agree with that? The employees of the hospital that had been with us for years, non-Seventh-day Adventists, I said to Yao, they must be included in that list. I insist on it. Same was true of this institution. We have some wonderful people working here that are non-Seventh-day Adventists. They've been my nurses. I know. They're loving and they're caring. So here they are at Loma Linda. The big job now is to find jobs for them, to get them find where they're going to get their education. Some went to Florida, some went to Idaho, some went to Washington, Oregon, scattered all over. Most of them stayed in Southern California. Some went to Glendale Adventist. Later on, I became president of the Southern California Conference. I walked up to Glendale Adventist Hospital for lunch one day, and a nurse came out. She was eating there. She came over to me. She said, Pastor Watts, you don't know who I am, but I'm one of those that you were able to get out of the country, out of Vietnam. I've married. I have a child. I'm so happy. I said, well, God bless you. It's good to see you. I am a witness to what God can do. And I want to tell you, the reason that I'm telling this story tonight is to give you courage and to give you confidence that as uncertain as the future may be, and we know that the days ahead of us are not going to be better on this old battered planet, that as difficult and dark as those days may be, we have nothing to fear. Because you see, we serve a God that nothing is impossible for. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. We'll see more before the Lord comes. We'll see more. But I'm happy tonight that I could just share with you the most traumatic experience that I went through. And our good wives, my wife Pat, they were in Singapore, not knowing what was going on. We cannot communicate between Saigon and Singapore. Pat did not know but what I had remained behind in Saigon. She did not know whether I had even left or not. She did not know where I was. That was true of the other missionary wives, of Elaine and of Ruth. They were praying. They were praying earnestly that God would watch over us. Yes, I was concerned for my family, for my wife and my kids. But I knew that my responsibility that moment, that time, was to do what I could to help our people leave Vietnam. Now, was it the right decision? That's been debated for years. Did we do the right thing by taking our mission leaders out? That's been debated. But I got a letter from the president, former president of the China division, and he wrote me a letter, if the time ever comes in Vietnam where the leaders need to be taken out, he said, by all means, Pastor Watts, get them out of the country. That thought was with me during these days. It was a difficult decision to make. Was I making the right decision? The final decision rested with me. I knew that. Now, I counseled. I sought counsel. We talked. We prayed. But final decision rested with me. But God, in His wisdom, had plans for the Vietnamese that came here to expand the work throughout North America. And today we have many Vietnamese churches all over North America because of those that came here in 1975. Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is there anything too hard for me? And the answer is, not a thing, Lord. Everything is possible. This is the story. Sad, because we left behind some. Some were on the list to go, chose not to go. Came to me years later, after they were here, said the worst mistake of their lives. They never should have stayed by. I counseled them. I said, it's your decision. Some that should have come, but we couldn't get to them. So those are the decisions of life that are difficult to make. And we pray for wisdom. We pray for judgment. We pray for discernment. And I believe with all my heart, God answered our prayers in the way that we least expected. Thank you. God bless you. And
wow. Very powerful. I hope this story of God's faithfulness to Ralph Watts and everyone over there inspires you and reminds you of what God can do for you in your life. Whatever situation you are going through, that He will be faithful. His timing may not be your timing, but He will be there for you and He will be faithful and provide. I would like to call the deacons forward at this time for the offering. And while they are getting the offering, I think we have time for just one question.
A couple of questions if we have quick.
And while we're getting the offering, and is there anyone that has a question? He had a lot of details. Boy, you're a good storyteller, so I don't know if you covered everything, but if there is a question at this time, you may ask it. Otherwise, we have one right here.
Do you have any connection with the last flight out of Pan Am and
Out of where? Yes. We were one of the last flights to leave because the city fell within a couple of days after we left. And the evacuation flights continued for another day. And then from that point on, the only ones to leave were those that left by helicopter. So the helicopters came in to the embassy, you remember. And unfortunately, because of the decision of the ambassador, some of the key Vietnamese that should have been taken out of the country did not make it out of the country because he held up the evacuation. If everything could have gone the way that the military had planned it, many more could have been evacuated. But you know what happened later? The boat people. People are so anxious to have freedom, to have liberty. They'll do anything for it. And they got on these little crafts out in the Gulf, tried to find safety by getting on one of those little ships. Many of them got picked up by pirates, the women assaulted, everything taken, boat sometimes overturned. Thousands and thousands were lost at sea. Many made it to Malaysia, to Thailand, finally made their way here. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to have to stop at that question, but you will be out for just a couple of minutes out there, won't you, before you have to catch your flight? So, yes.
That's good. That's good.
Of course. All right. If there was anyone who was involved in this, would you please stand
Yeah.
this evening?
Those that were involved, can I mention Jim? Could I add another to it? Anyone that's here that at any time came over to Vietnam and either was with a heart team or came over and worked at Saigon Adventist Hospital, those of you that are here, I would like to see your faces too. Would you stand?
Wonderful. Well, a couple of things to remind you about. There is the social, the watermelon feed, right out in the courtyard after this. And there will be books that Ralph Watts has written about his experience. They are free, but we are just asking if you get one, if you could make a $10 donation, and those proceeds go directly to the work that is happening in Vietnam. So he doesn't keep anything. It's all for the missionary work there. So if you would like one, they will be out at a table on the side as well. And if you see Roy Ice, Pastor Roy Ice out there, wish him a happy birthday. Today is his birthday. He's right back here. And so we will have prayer right now and then go to our social. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for this incredible evening where we have heard how faithful you were. God, we are in awe of how you work. We are in awe of how much you love us. and for what you do for us. And Father God, I would just pray that for all who are sitting here and all who have listened to the story and who are experiencing situations in their own lives, I pray that you would work miracles of faithfulness to them. May they feel your presence. May they know that you love them just as much and that you will always provide for them. We pray a special blessing on Ralph Watts. Thank you so much for his perseverance, for the way that he cared for the individuals over there, and for what he did. He was also very faithful. And so, God, we just give you our lives, and we ask that you will go with us the rest of this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thanks for coming out. You can use the exits on this side or through the foyer if you would like to go out to the social.